R. Mitchell Wiggin, Wiggin.
When were you born?
September 14th, 1925, so I'm halfway to 84.
Okay. It's okay that I ask you some questions?
Go ahead.
Okay. Where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Well, my parents and I was 16. My parents and I, on a Sunday at noon, would either have a small pot roast or a roast chicken. And that day we had roast chicken, finished it, went into the living room, sat down. We were going to listen, not watch, Arturo Toscanini and the NBC Symphony Orchestra, which we did on Sunday afternoons. And all of a sudden, an announcer cut on the radio saying, "Emergency alarm, the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor." And we all said, "Where the hell is Pearl Harbor?" We hadn't the faintest idea. And then they cut back to the symphony that they changed the songs. And the first thoughts were how much our lives were going to change now there was going to be a world war. Very distinct feeling on that. Okay, what next?
How did it make you feel?
How did it make me feel? Well, I knew I was going to be 4F through the osteomyelitis I had had when I was 9 years old. And I wanted to become a naval architect. I was going to go to Pratt Institute over in Brooklyn till I discovered how much mathematics were involved, and I said, I'm not going to do that. And there was not much point in going to college otherwise, because all the colleges were being V8, V12, V16 accelerated courses for people to become officers candidates. So I went to work for a company about 2 blocks away from our house in East Orange, Lock Joint Pipe Company, where my father had worked for 15 years way back in the 20s. And I started out as an assistant timekeeper in the manufacturing, which was a metalworking shop. We were one of the leading manufacturers of concrete pressure water pipe, concrete drain pipe, and concrete sewer pipe. Drains and sewer not always being the same thing. And during the war, we provided the water pipe, pressure water pipe, for munitions factories, explosive factories, Army, Navy encampments that were being built, water supplies for towns that were popping up due to war explosions of manufacturing. The thing that struck us most about the immediate effect of the war is rationing was put in, not in 41, it was put in 42, but you had coupons. And if you ask your mother, she has the coupon book that I had. You had coupons for shoes, leather shoes. You were allowed either 1 or 2 pairs a year. And if you were a young man growing up, too bad, because you just didn't get to buy shoes if they were a little bit tight. Gasoline was rationed. A, B, and C coupons. A got you 2 gallons a week. B got you, 8 or 9 gallons a week. And C was unlimited, like doctors, emergency, fire, police, taxi cabs. Butter was rationed. Sugar was rationed. I think you were restricted to 1 or 2 suits a year for clothing. But the worst thing of all for the food rationing was the people in Wisconsin, which was the principal source then of butter in the U.S. and the principal source of 80% of the butter in the U.S., they invented a thing called oleomargarine, which is synthetic butter we use now. But then it was a lard-like subject, and the butter people wouldn't let it be sold colored. So you got this white mass of soft consistency in a little packet of yellow dye, which you then had to put in and knead and knead and knead until you had an even yellow-colored mass, which was what oleomargarine. But the people in Wisconsin would not let that be done in a factory. They forced you to do it so you were aware of the real quality of butter. It was 2-bit, but that's what they did. The weirdest thing we did about lock joint was we had to send a whole shipload of concrete drain and sewer pipe up to Iceland. And we figured, why? Well, the problem was they were building a naval and an air base up there, and the ground was frozen tundra. And if they built buildings on top of that, the heat in the buildings would melt the tundra, and the buildings would sink. So they laid the pipe not in the ground, but on top of the ground as tubes, and then built on top of that, which prevented the heat from melting the tundra. We put our car up on blocks in 42 or 3 because we had immediate access to trains, buses. You could walk to grocery stores in our neighborhood. But you put them up on blocks, otherwise the tires would take a set from being weighted on the ground. I put the car back in commission in 44. I was working 5.5, 6 days a week. We were doing war work, even though it was concrete pipe. A young friend of mine had started a dance band. We had an unusually talented group of juniors and seniors in high school, and most of the professional musicians were in service. So we got country club, sorority, private clubs, dances, because we were a good band and we were available. Well, I had to have the car so I could take myself and the leader and the bandstands and the music and the amplifier set to these jobs. Well, you couldn't do that on 2 gallons a week. And gas then was 12, 13, 14 cents a gallon. So if you went to any city service gas station, the nearest one to me was over in Bloomfield, you could get all the black market gas you wanted at 20 cents a gallon. Wow, 20 cents a gallon. It was 1/3 more than you're used to paying. The reason they conserved gas was not because of the gas production, it was to conserve rubber, because all the rubber in the world came from the Far East, which the Japanese had very carefully taken over, and synthetic rubber was just in the middle of being invented. So the gas rationing was to stop wearing tires out, not because of the lack of gas as such. What else do you want to know?
Another question related to that. Did you have any friends or people you knew went into war?
Oh, absolutely. I knew a lot of my friends I was young when I was in high school, so I got out when I was 17, having taken a postgraduate course. So my senior year in PG were like study, class, you know, it was easy going. But many men were either volunteering to go into service or were being drafted. One of my good friends was an airplane pilot, pursuit pilot, who was shot down over, I guess, Germany. Our band was getting decimated by people going into service. Some were sent to Germany as occupation troops because the war was over in August, April of 45. But we still had the band going because people were not discharged enough to get regular bands back together again. It didn't affect me personally, except for the various shortages. I wrote a lot of letters to people who were in service. You saw them when they came back on leave. But civilian life was a little bit rough. You were required to save all the grease from whatever cooking you did and turn it in. It was used to make either soap or munitions. You were required to save all tin cans and flatten them, but not completely. They used acid to get the zinc out of them, which was the galvanized coating on the inside of a can then, because zinc was an imported metal, and they recycled the rest of it, steel, for sake of steel. You were asked if you would scrap any surplus aluminum pots and pans you had, because aluminum was in shortage because of aircraft production. My father became an air raid warden, and we had a little stirrup pump in the basement that was 5 gallon capacity, and you put your foot on it and pumped up and down. And he had a nice armband that said Air Raid Warden, and they had blackouts periodically because, you know, East Orange was going to be bombed by the Germans and the Russians, that's for sure.
How did that threat make you feel?
How did it grab me?
The threat of being bombed.
Oh, it was nonsense.
Nonsense.
It was to make you conscious of the war, and if anything happened, where were the planes going to come from? People couldn't fly across the Atlantic or the Pacific. That was a post-war development. But it was the idea was to conserve power, because everybody had to put in blackout shades, and street lights were turned off. And if you had a girlfriend, the first thing you heard the siren, you ran for her house because you had a 2-hour makeout session coming. It was a nuisance. They ran air raid alerts probably every 3 or 4 months for 2 or 3 years, and became pretty obvious that by 1944 we were not going to be bombed. In the proximity we were to New York City, it was probably more of a threat than if you were at High Point, New Jersey, but it wasn't a real threat. I remember once we went down, before we put the car on the blocks, went down to the Jersey Shore to Raspberry Park, and there were curtains all along the boardwalk between that and the sand. Why? And the curtains were black, thick, about 10 feet high. The principal source of oil for making gasoline and motor oil was Venezuela, and the tankers would come up and either go into the Delaware Bay for Philadelphia or into the New York Harbor for Bayonne, where we still have major oil refineries and gasoline refineries. And the German U-boats would sit offshore 4 or 5 miles, and they would see the silhouette of these tankers going through, and they would torpedo them. And if you walked on the beach in daylight, there were big clumps of raw crude oil all along the shore, all along the Jersey Shore and all along the Long Island shore from these tankers that went down. Well, they put the blackout curtains up to see if they couldn't prevent the ships being silhouetted against the lights.
Next question. Okay. When you heard about the atomic bomb being dropped, how did that make you feel?
Well, they had two thoughts about it, because they were pretty careful how they worded the news releases. It was obvious that the surrender had to happen in the near future. I mean, the destruction of Nagasaki and Hiroshima was tremendous. And the second thing you thought of was, oh my God, 100,000 people died in 10 seconds. It could have just flattened mile after mile of the towns. A great triumph for American air power, a great triumph for American science and manufacturing to make a bomb that was small enough to be loaded into an airplane. But the horror of the number of people that were killed in one fell swoop, you were ambivalent. Yeah, I'm glad, yeah, but I sure as hell wouldn't want it to happen to me. I don't even recall where I was when I heard about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because they were only 2 days apart. You heard about Hiroshima first, or Hiroshima, and wow, you were impressed. And then what's going to happen? And then 2 days later they bombed Nagasaki, and it was pretty obvious that the Japanese simply had to quit. They were going to occupy Hawaiian Islands as a base to attack the West Coast. The Japs actually floated balloons when they knew where the air currents were, with bombs inside of them, and some of them landed up in the Oregon and Washington forests and caused small fires. It was the only actual. Oh, and they had U-boat people landing on Long Island in little boats to get into New York City and supposedly cause some kind of sabotage. Well, they were picked up by the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard patrolled every inch of the beach in Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey, Long Island. But damned if I recall exactly where I was when I heard about the atomic bomb. Remember the effects, though. Yeah, you're absolutely horrified.
Okay, so you said that they clearly had to surrender. When they did surrender and the war was over, what did you do? Did you celebrate? Did you have any friends from war
Well,
come
a
back?
bunch of us got on a bus and went down to Newark. So it must have been late in the day, or it must have been on a Saturday. Went down to Newark, to the area around Broad and Market Street, which is the focal point then of downtown Newark, and you hooped and hollered and shook hands, and some girls got kissed and some didn't. And after about an hour of that, you said, "The hell with it," and got in the bus and went home again. But you didn't have any overt celebration, and we were not in a position of being old enough to drink, so it wasn't a question of going to hang in a bar. My father got upset because he was a bourbon drinker, and because of the wartime restriction on alcohol, which was used to make explosives, if you bought a bottle of bourbon, you had to buy 2 bottles of rum, because rum was made in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, and it was cheap and readily available and wasn't affected by wartime supplies. So we had rum in the house, not where I learned how to like rum, but rum in the house because of, if you didn't get any bourbon.
Was it easy to adjust back to normal life when the war was over?
Was it easy to? Relatively easy, because things would go off ration slowly and surely, and the world was coming back to life again. I remember distinctly sometime in late 45, probably, we had an honest to God sirloin steak, and it was the first real tasty sirloin steak we'd had since 1941. I can still taste it. It was absolutely wonderful. Myself, I was still working. We went back to 5.5 days, 5 days a week, but I had a substantial position even though I was 23, 24, and I started to have a different life. Went to racetracks, went to ballet, operas, theaters, museums, trying to find things that would interest me that you couldn't do during the war. If you found something you liked, fine, you found it. If you didn't, at least you tried it. I became knowledgeable about ballet, but I wouldn't spend money to go see a ballet troupe now. But I understood what they were doing. I started to like polo. I went to Fort Hamilton, where the Verrazano Bridge is now. It's a beautiful polo field. Had great polo. But gradually the world came back to life. Obviously gas rationing went off. You could buy tires. Detroit started to make cars again, although they were the same cars that they made in 1941 until they could get new dyes and new designs and new stampings.
Times Square. Times Square came alive. The lights came on in Times Square.
Well, they were only dimmed during the war. There were still lights on in Times Square, believe me.
I think that's all the questions we have.
I'm trying to think of anything else that was significant. Oh, I had double-decker bunk beds in my room, and I used the bottom because it was the easiest thing to do. But the top one was a bed spring, and I would take maps from the National Geographic and tuck them into the bed spring. And I can recall during 43, when the Russians got into the war on the English and American side, following the progress of the Germans into Russia and then being stymied. But I had a map that gave me the details, and I would turn the radio on to the news and see where the hell the troops were then. I remember I got sick and tired of Stalingrad because I had a siege that went on 15 months there. The Germans couldn't crack it, and the Russians wouldn't quit. But the shortages, that was the biggest thing about the war, the shortages. I mean, it was a black market, sure, but we didn't buy black market. The only thing I ever bought black market was gasoline. That's enough?
Mhm.
Oh, I can spiel on if you want, you know.
All right, thank you.
Okay, turn it off and wait till Joyce gets on.
Your name, when were you born?
Joyce Cudlip Wiggin, born May 5th, 1933.
Your daily life, if it did at all.
All right. Well, going back to Pearl Harbor again, we were in our living room listening to the radio, which I guess is what we all did on Sunday afternoons when the Pearl Harbor announcement was made. I was only what, 12?
12, yeah.
12, so I had different reactions. I was more affected by the fear of the war, but not understanding really what it was and where it was going. Grandpa followed it very carefully. I would look at the headlines in the paper and I'd listen to my parents.
You weren't 12, you were 8.
Oh, 8 to start with. Yes, 12 at the end. Yeah, sorry. My mother drove for the Motor Corps for the Red Cross. She would take a lot of the boys who were inducted into service over to Brooklyn to get into the actual war. My father did a lot of the air raid warden stuff as well, and I just remember having to pull down the shades and have it dark, and the lights from the airports, which were searching for the planes, and I was a little bit frightened because I was so young. One of the things we did was have our own victory garden and our own chickens, and that was a way to help save the money and help save the war effort. In Short Hills, we did not have street lights on. We didn't have any street signs. I lived up near the Day Estates. Greenwood Gardens is today, and we could come out of there, and my mother was able to get the car to coast all the way down to the center of town, down to the gas station. We would get down to the Short Hills post office once a week to pick up the mail. And there was no such thing as mail delivery. When I went from school to choir at Christ Church, we had to cut through people's backyards and walk because we had to have one mother come down to pick 4 or 5 kids up, but didn't have people just dropping us off at school. You missed the school bus, you walked because there was no available gas. As far as going out for meals, there was no such thing as fast food like all you people have today. And if you went out for a Sunday dinner, that would be most unusual. My father did have a Howard Johnson restaurant out in Morris County because it was near Picatinny Arsenal, whereas they still are doing a lot of the munitions work. And he was able to therefore sell food to a lot of the people who worked there. That would be their opportunity to go out for a meal. We did a lot of scout work. Oh, one of the things I did when I was in Hobart Avenue School in 5th and 6th grade, we knit squares, 6-inch squares at lunchtime. Each day you would do one, and these were then given to the Red Cross and sewn into Afghans, lap robes for the soldiers who came back as wounded. Let's see, what else can I think of? The cigarette, my parents smoked. I didn't go so little, but inside the pack of cigarettes was the aluminum barrier before the cigarettes. They would take the aluminum foil and roll it into balls, and that also went to the war effort for the aluminum.
Chewing gum wrappers, too.
Chewing gum wrappers, yes, because you took the inside one out, and then what was left was you could make chains of. And they still do that today by folding them over. So there were a lot of economical things that we did, and you didn't go very far. We could go to movies on a Saturday afternoon, which would have newsreels, a cartoon, and one main feature, and that would cost us something like 25 cents. And again, one parent would come down and pick up a whole carload, and that would have kept us busy for a Saturday afternoon. Other than that, there wasn't too much activity to do. Say, Grandpa did the band, but again, we were young. Any other question I can?
Now everybody's younger than I am.
Yeah, of course.
Pretty much covered, unless you want to talk about where you were specifically, like I asked Grandpa about the atomic bomb or when.
As Grandpa, I don't really remember. I remember when we had the Enola Gay dropping the atomic bomb and the devastation that it caused. But yes, we were elated about it to some extent because yes, it's the end of the war. The guys are going to come home. But as far as otherwise getting back into reality, as he said, it's slow. It was slow because, gee, you could then go out and buy things that were rationed. My mother had difficulty using a pound of sugar in a month or whatever it was. Other people who were bakers, they had a terrible time because they couldn't have the sugar. So mother would give that to somebody else. You would trade off things. But no, the lights came. That's what I said, the lights came on again, and you knew you were safe and that the world would get better. Fortunately, my father had a decent job that I didn't have to worry about real problems, soup kitchens and all the things that so many people did who lost their jobs. My mother didn't have to go to work in one of the assembly lines or anything like that. We were very fortunate.
All right, I think that's it. But just
I got something else I want to walk in and just say once you're through.
Okay.
just for the record,
But 20 odd years ago, what became our first son-in-law was a supervisor of handicapped people down in Washington D.C. area, and they used to clean the Jefferson Memorial. They would clean the Lincoln Memorial, and one of the things they would clean would be what they call Silver Hill. It's to the east of the Capitol. It's like 10 Quonset huts, each hut being almost the size of a football field, bigger than most Quonset huts. And 3 of them were devoted to air and space. They were full of airplanes, in parts, in working condition, in unworking condition, in restoration. And I remember they had guided tours, which were one 10 o'clock in the morning, Monday through Friday, and on Saturday they had a 10 o'clock and a 1 o'clock. So I went to the one in the morning, and the guy would herd 2 or 3 or 4 people, whatever showed up, because it wasn't well known, it wasn't that popular. And he opened up the door to the first Quonset hut, and we walked in, and the first thing we all said is, oh shit. There was the nose part of the Enola Gay with the big name Enola Gay plastered on it, in the middle of consideration, which eventually was done and put over in the Air and Space Museum at Dulles Airport. But I remember, because all of us knew what Enola Gay was. Oh, God, there it is in real life. One of the things I saw, there was a SPAD, a two-seater, a two-wing single-seat fighter from World War I. And it was interesting because they were trying to reconstruct it with the same kind of dope paint, same kind of canvas, the same kind of screws, so the restoration would be as perfect as possible. And I learned that they were trying to find old SPAD pilots so they could have some idea of flight characteristics and how they were used. Turns out that one of them was a man from Summit that lived about a half mile away from here. And he was hauled down to Silver Hill to look at the plane and discuss it. And he said, you know, the only fire protection we had was an aluminum sheet that was the seat and the back of your actual seat, because we didn't know if a plane was underneath us and they were going to machine gun us. That was our only protection. Otherwise, we could see and avoid. He said, if you look very carefully, you'll see that the left front of the seat there has got a nick in it. If you look very carefully, the right top of the shoulder's got a nick in it. And I've got the scar on my shoulder. He says, this was the plane that I used in World War I. Oh, my God, unbelievable. That's the one that hangs up in the air and space down on the mall now. But kind of a personal story about World War I and not World War II, unfortunately.